Ethan Marsh had been married for 11 days when he found out his backyard had a new stone wall in it, and he found out the way most people find out anything important these days, from a neighbor's Facebook post, tagged with 3 exclamation points and a photo taken from a drone. He and his wife Claire had just landed at Port Columbus International after 10 days in Costa Rica, sunburned, sleep-deprived, and still arguing pleasantly about whether the surf lesson in Tamarindo counted as the best or the worst decision of the honeymoon. Claire's phone buzzed first, then Ethan's. Then both of them, standing at baggage claim in Terminal B, scrolled through the same 43 comments on a post from a woman named Denise Okafor, who lived 2 doors down on Falcon Ridge Court and apparently considered herself the unofficial press secretary of the Falcon Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. The post read, "Beautiful addition to our community entrance. So happy the board finally got this done. Been asking for 5 years. Hashtag Falcon Ridge Proud. Hashtag Curb Appeal." The photo showed a stacked stone wall, 4 feet high, capped with flat granite, running in a neat L shape along what used to be the back corner of Ethan and Claire's half-acre lot at 4417 Falcon Ridge Court. A wrought iron gate had been mounted at the center, flanked by 2 ornamental lanterns on timers. It looked expensive. It looked permanent. It looked like it belonged to somebody, and Ethan was fairly sure that somebody was supposed to be him. "That's our yard," Claire said, not as a question. "That's our yard," Ethan agreed. Claire scrolled back through the comment thread a second time, looking for context, and found it in a comment from Marla Fenwick herself, posted the previous Thursday. "So proud of what we accomplished this week. Sometimes you just have to move forward for the good of the whole community. Nothing about a homeowner, nothing about a property line. Just the quiet, self-congratulatory tone of someone who had already decided the outcome was worth whatever it cost somebody else to get there. Move forward for the good of the whole community," Ethan repeated, reading it a 3rd time at the baggage carousel, watching other people's suitcases go by. While their own bags sat somewhere in a cargo hold, he was no longer thinking about it all. "That's our land, Claire. That's not a community amenity. That's the actual dirt behind our shed." They did not speak again until the rental car shuttle, and then only to confirm they were both seeing the same thing, and were both, in fact, furious about it. "Drop your city, and tell me, do you live in an HOA? I want to know how many of you are watching this from behind enemy lines right now." By the time the Marshes pulled into the driveway of 4417 Falcon Ridge Court at 9:40 p.m. on a Tuesday in April, the wall was lit up like a monument, which, in a sense, it was. A small bronze plaque had been bolted to the capstone, reading, "The Estates at Falcon Ridge, Est 1987, Beautified 2026, Board of Directors." Ethan stood in his own backyard, still holding his carry-on, staring at 4 feet of stacked granite that had not been there when he left for his wedding, and did the math on how a board of 5 unpaid volunteers had managed to commission, permit, and build a structural retaining wall with integrated lighting in the time it took him to get a spray tan and learn to surf. The answer, it turned out, was that they hadn't asked anyone's permission, least of all his. Ethan Marsh was 34 years old and worked as a GIS analyst for the Cobb County Assessor's Office, which meant he spent his professional life reading plat maps, parcel boundaries, and recorded easements for a living. It was, by any measure, a spectacularly inconvenient job for the Falcon Ridge Estates Homeowners Association to have picked a fight with, though nobody involved in building the wall seemed to know that yet. He pulled up the county GIS portal on his phone, standing in his own yard in the dark, jet-lagged, and zoomed in on parcel 14-22-311-017. His parcel. Lot 17. The wall, according to the satellite overlay he'd helped maintain for 6 years, sat almost entirely on his side of the recorded boundary line. Not close to the line, not arguably on the line, about 11 feet inside it, cutting a chunk out of the back corner of his property to connect the community's private access road, Falcon Ridge Court, to the retention pond easement behind Lot 19. They built a wall on our land, Ethan said to Claire, who was still in her travel clothes, holding 2 mugs of tea she'd made out of pure reflexive spite. While we were in Costa Rica, they built a wall on our land and put a plaque on it, thanking themselves. Claire looked at the plaque, looked at the wall, looked at her husband. "Well," she said, "happy honeymoon." Falcon Ridge Estates had been built in 1987 by a developer named Corbin Weatherstone, who platted 42 lots around a shared cul-de-sac and a man-made retention pond he'd optimistically labeled Falcon Lake on the original marketing brochures, despite the fact that it was 11 feet deep at its lowest point and populated mostly by geese. Weatherstone Development Group dissolved in 1994, 3 years after the last lot sold, in the kind of quiet, undramatic bankruptcy that leaves behind exactly the sort of paperwork gaps that nobody notices until somebody has a reason to go looking. The subdivision itself was the picture of unremarkable Midwestern comfort. 2-story colonials with vinyl siding in 4 approved color palettes, mailboxes standardized down to the finial, a community sign at the entrance with landscaping that rotated seasonally, mums in fall, pansies in spring, courtesy of a contract with Greenleaf Property Services that the HOA had held, uninterrupted, for 11 years, quarterly newsletters, a pool nobody used after Labor Day but everybody fought about at budget time. In short, it was the kind of place people moved to because they wanted to stop thinking about their house and start thinking about their kids' soccer schedule, which was exactly why almost nobody in Falcon Ridge Estates had read their CC&Rs since closing day. Ethan and Claire had bought 4,417 Falcon Ridge Court 2 years earlier, drawn by the good schools, the mature oak trees, and, this would later become a source of dark amusement to both of them, the quiet, well-managed community their realtor had promised them, backed up by an HOA disclosure packet that listed annual dues of $340 and a reserve fund balance that looked, at the time, perfectly healthy. Ethan and Claire had met the way a lot of people in their 30s meet now, through a mutual friend's engagement party, and had spent 2 years dating long distance between Cobb County and Pittsburgh before Claire finally transferred to a hospital 20 minutes from Millbrook Falls and moved into the house on Falcon Ridge Court full-time. Their wedding had been small, 70 guests, held at a restored barn 40 minutes outside the city, and the honeymoon, 10 days in Costa Rica, booked 8 months in advance, paid for in installments, Ethan had tracked in a spreadsheet with the same obsessive precision he brought to parcel data, had been the one thing in an otherwise frugal wedding budget they'd refused to compromise on. They had joked, boarding the flight, that the house would still be standing when they got back. It had been, technically, it had simply grown a wall. The board that ran Falcon Ridge Estates in the spring of the wall was small and, like most HOA boards, had been quietly captured by the people with the most free time and the strongest opinions. Marla Fenwick had been board president for 6 years. She was 61, recently retired from a regional bank's compliance department, and ran the Falcon Ridge Estates HOA the way she imagined she'd once run a branch office, with binders, agendas, and an unshakable conviction that she alone understood what the community deserved. Don Kowalski, the treasurer, was a soft-spoken accountant who signed whatever Marla put in front of him. Priscilla Yates, the secretary, took minutes that somehow never quite matched what anyone remembered being said in the meeting. 2 other seats rotated through neighbors who joined with good intentions and resigned within 18 months, worn down by Tuesday night emails that began with, "per my last email," and ended with veiled threats about fiduciary responsibility. Life in Falcon Ridge Estates ran on a rhythm most residents found comforting rather than confining, at least until they crossed the board on something. There was a 4th of July block party every year, funded out of the operating budget, complete with a rented bounce house and a chili cook-off Marla Fenwick had won. by her own count, 4 years running, judged by a panel she herself appointed. There was a landscaping committee that inspected every yard twice a year, with a clipboard checklist so detailed it specified acceptable mulch colors. There was an architectural review process for anything from a new roof to a repainted shutter, technically reasonable in a subdivision built to a certain aesthetic standard, but administered, in practice, with the enthusiasm of people who had found, in HOA governance, the only real position of authority they would ever hold. Most homeowners paid their $340 in quarterly installments, nodded through the newsletters, and never gave the board a second thought, which was exactly how the board liked it. For 6 years, the entrance to Falcon Ridge Estates had bothered Marla Fenwick more than almost anything else in her life. The retention pond was visible from Falcon Ridge Court the moment you turned in off Meridian Parkway, and Marla had decided, sometime around 2020, that this was an embarrassment. She wanted a wall, a real one. Stone, not the cheap precast block the Stonebridge Crossing HOA 2 miles away had put in, which she mentioned in nearly every board meeting, with the particular contempt reserved for a rival she'd never actually spoken to. The problem, and this was the part nobody on the board had bothered to check carefully enough, was that the ideal spot for that wall, the spot that would actually block the view of the pond from the road, sat on private property, specifically on the back corner of Lot 17. Nobody remembered, by 2026, that Lot 17's deed carried something unusual. A residual strip of land, 11 feet by roughly 90, running along the edge of the private road easement that had never been formally conveyed to the Homeowners Association when Weatherstone Development Group folded. In 1994, in the chaos of the bankruptcy, the developer's remaining undedicated common areas, including the fee title to Falcon Ridge Court itself, the private road that served lots 14 through 19, had been assigned, through a scrivener's oversight nobody had caught in 3 decades of title transfers, to whoever held title to Lot 17 at the time. That 1994 owner sold to another family in 2003. That family sold to the Marshes in 2024. And at every closing, every title company, every appraiser, every HOA disclosure packet had simply assumed the road belonged to the association, because that's how every other private road in every other subdivision in Cobb County worked, and nobody thought to check. There was, in fact, a second casualty of that same 1994 bankruptcy that nobody in Falcon Ridge Estates had ever noticed either. The small triangular parcel behind lots 18 and 19, informally used for decades as an overflow parking pad during the annual block party, which the same quitclaim deed had also folded into the Lot 17 conveyance, without anyone at the time realizing its significance. For 32 years, it had simply been mowed by whichever landscaping contractor the association hired, treated as common property by simple inertia, the way most suburban assumptions calcify into fact, long before anyone checks whether they were ever true. Ethan Marsh would eventually check. But on the night he landed from his honeymoon, all he knew was that a wall had appeared in his yard, and he intended to have it removed by breakfast. Now that you know Ethan Marsh, has your HOA ever pulled something that made your blood boil? Tell me the worst thing your HOA has ever done, and I mean the worst. The first email arrived from Briarstone Community Management. The third-party firm Falcon Ridge Estates paid $1,100 a month to handle administrative work, at 7:14 the next morning. Ethan hadn't sent anything yet. He hadn't had the chance. The subject line read, "Notice of Violation, Lot 17, Unauthorized Objection to Board-Approved Community Improvement." He read it twice, standing in his kitchen, in the same clothes he'd worn on the plane, coffee going cold in his hand. "Dear homeowner," it began, in the tone reserved for people who are about to be condescended to at length, "it has come to the board's attention, via social media commentary attributed to your household, that you object to the recently completed Community Entrance Beautification Project. Please be advised that this project was approved unanimously by the Board of Directors on March 3, 2026, pursuant to Article 7, Section 7.4 of the Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions for Falcon Ridge Estates, which grants the association authority to maintain and improve common areas. Any further public objection or interference with this project will be treated as a violation of Article 12, Section 12.1, Conduct Detrimental to the Association, and may result in fines of up to $250 per occurrence. Ethan had not, at the time this email was sent, said a single word to the board. He had, at 11:52 the previous night, replied to Denise Okafor's Facebook post with a single sentence: "This wall is on my property line, not the community's." Somebody, Ethan suspected Priscilla Yates, who monitored the Neighbourhood Facebook group with the dedication of a Cold War intelligence officer, had screenshotted it and forwarded it to Briarstone before he'd even gone to bed. Claire read the email over his shoulder twice, then read it a third time out loud, in the flat, disbelieving voice of someone reciting a hospital billing statement. "Unauthorized objection," she repeated. "We haven't objected to anything yet. We've been in the country for 14 hours. They fined us for a Facebook comment before we'd even had breakfast," Ethan said. "That's not enforcement. That's a reflex," he wrote back within the hour. He kept it simple, because he already knew, professionally, that simple was about to win. "I have not interfered with anything. I have stated a fact. Per Cobb County GIS parcel records, the structure referenced sits inside the recorded boundary of Lot 17, which I own. Please provide the survey or legal description the board relied upon to authorize construction on this location, and please advise who will be removing the wall and repairing the disturbed soil." The reply came 4 days later, not from Briarstone, but from Marla Fenwick herself, CCing the entire board, and curiously, Denise Okafor, who had no official role in the association whatsoever, but who Marla seemed to treat as a kind of unofficial fourth branch of government. "Mr. Marsh," it read, "the Beautification Committee relied on the original 1987 plat, which clearly designates this area as part of the common area maintained by the association for the benefit of all 42 lots. The board is not in the business of conducting new surveys every time a homeowner disagrees with an improvement that 90% of the community has been asking for since before you moved in. We would appreciate a more cooperative attitude going forward, particularly given that your fines for landscaping non-compliance are already outstanding." The landscaping fine was real, and it was petty, and it had nothing to do with the wall, except that it perfectly illustrated the kind of board Ethan and Claire were dealing with. 6 weeks before the wedding, Briarstone had issued a $150 violation notice for unapproved ornamental grass exceeding 18 inches in height, front yard, in violation of Article 9, Section 9.2. The ornamental grass in question was a single clump of Carl Förster featherreed grass that Claire had planted along their front walk, a variety explicitly listed as pre-approved in the association's own 2019 landscaping guidelines. Ethan had sent the guidelines back to Briarstone with the relevant page highlighted. Nobody had responded. The fine had simply sat there, accruing, technically unpaid, and Marla Fenwick was now wielding it like a loaded weapon in an entirely unrelated argument about a wall on his land. "We would like to resolve this amicably," Marla's email continued. "The board is willing to waive the outstanding $150 landscaping fine if you agree in writing to withdraw your objection to the beautification project and refrain from further public commentary." Ethan read that sentence 4 times. It was, he would later say in a deposition, the moment he stopped being annoyed and started being methodical. Before he pulled a single record, Ethan did something he would later recommend to every homeowner who ever emailed the HOA Horror Files channel asking for advice. He went back through his own file cabinet and reread, cover to cover, all 41 pages of the Falcon Ridge Estates Declaration of Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, the document he'd skimmed once at closing and never opened again. Article 7, Section 7.4, the provision Marla had cited, granted the association authority to maintain and improve common areas as defined in Exhibit A of this declaration. He found Exhibit A on page 38. It was a hand-drawn site map, photocopied so many times over 3 decades that the lot lines had gone soft and gray, showing the pool, the clubhouse, the pond, and the roadway, all shaded in the same cross-hatched pattern labeled Common Area. Nowhere on the map, and nowhere in the accompanying legal description, was there any citation to a recorded deed actually vesting that common area designation in the association. It was, Ethan realized, a map of what everyone had always assumed, not a record of what anyone had ever legally conveyed. That distinction, between a shared belief and a shared title, was about to become the entire case. He did not reply to Marla. Instead, he opened his work laptop, logged into the county's Recorder of Deeds portal using his own professional credentials, and pulled the full chain of title for Lot 17, all the way back to the original 1987 plat and the 1994 dissolution filings for Weatherstone Development Group. It took him 3 hours, a skill set most homeowners simply don't have, and by the end of it he was looking at a scanned, slightly crooked 1994 quitclaim deed, filed in the dusty back half of the county archive, in which Weatherstone Development Group LLC, in the process of winding down, conveyed all remaining right, title and interest in the undedicated common areas of Falcon Ridge Estates, including, but not limited to, the roadway known as Falcon Ridge Court, to the then owner of Lot 17, a man named Reginald Boskovic, and his successors and assigns. Ethan sat back in his chair. He owned the road, not just the 11-foot strip the wall sat on. The entire private roadway, the one the Homeowners Association had spent 32 years believing it owned, maintaining with association dues, plowing every winter, repaving every decade, and now, apparently, building a beautification monument on top of, legally belonged to whoever held title to 4417 Falcon Ridge Court, which was, as of 18 months ago, Ethan and Claire Marsh. For a week, Ethan did nothing with the information, except confirm it. He drove to the county recorder's office in person and pulled certified copies. He called a title attorney named Renata Cho, a friend of Claire's from nursing school who'd married into a real estate law practice, and asked her, hypothetically, what it would mean if a private road serving 18 homes turned out to be titled to a single homeowner rather than the association that had been managing it for 3 decades. Hypothetically, Renata said, it would mean that homeowner has been extending an implied license to everyone else this entire time, probably without knowing it, and that license can be revoked. It would also mean the association has been trespassing, technically, every time they did work on that road without your permission, and it would mean every single one of your neighbors' access to their own driveways runs, legally, through your land. Hypothetically, Ethan said, how would someone go about proving that in a way a board that's currently threatening to fine him $250 a day would have to take seriously? Hypothetically, Renata said, that someone would want a licensed survey, a title report, and a lawyer. And hypothetically, that someone should stop replying to that board's emails until he has all 3. When Ethan called back a week later to retain her formally, Renata laid out, over coffee at a diner off Meridian Parkway, exactly how she wanted the case built, and exactly why patience was going to matter more than momentum. Boards like this one don't lose because someone proves them wrong in one dramatic moment, she said. They lose because someone builds a record so complete that by the time it reaches a courtroom or a recall vote, there's nothing left to argue about. You've got the deed. Good. Now we get the survey. We get the title report. We document every fine, every inconsistency, every email where Marla contradicts herself, and we let the paper do what paper does. You do not yell at these people. You do not give them a single clip of you looking unreasonable, because the moment you do, that's the only clip anyone shares. Ethan, who had spent the entire honeymoon flight home composing furious hypothetical speeches he never delivered to anyone, found the advice both deflating and, over the following months, exactly right. Ethan stopped replying to Marla Fenwick's emails. This, predictably, escalated things faster than anything he'd said. On May 6th, a certified letter arrived from Briarstone Community Management, informing the Marshes that their continued non-communication and non-compliance had resulted in a formal hearing being scheduled for May 20th before the Board of Directors to determine appropriate remedies, including but not limited to daily fines, suspension of common area privileges, and referral for lien placement pursuant to Article 14, Section 14.3 of the CC&Rs. Suspension of common area privileges. Ethan almost laughed out loud in his own driveway. The common area, whose privileges they intended to suspend, was the road his house sat on. Between the certified letter and the hearing itself, 2 weeks passed in which Briarstone's on-site manager, Gary Ott, made an unannounced inspection visit to 4417 Falcon Ridge Court, ostensibly to reassess the landscaping violation, and left a second notice on the Marsh's door, citing a new infraction. Unapproved exterior lighting fixture, rear patio, in violation of Article 9, Section 9.6, referring to a solar-powered string of lights Claire had hung for their post-honeymoon backyard dinner with her sister, a fixture that, by Ethan's count, was visually indistinguishable from identical string lights hanging on no fewer than 9 other patios along Falcon Ridge Court, none of which had ever been cited. He photographed all 9, time-stamped and geotagged, and added them to the folder he had started keeping, a folder that would, by autumn, run to over 400 pages. At the May 20th hearing, held, as always, in the cramped meeting room of the Millbrook Falls Public Library, folding chairs, a card table, and a portable whiteboard that had clearly seen better decades, Marla Fenwick opened by reading from a prepared statement that referred to the wall dispute as an unfortunate and frankly baffling escalation by a homeowner who appears determined to disrupt the harmony of this community over a fence line disagreement. Ethan, sitting with Claire in the second row of folding chairs, noted that Marla had specifically avoided the word wall in favor of fence line disagreement, which was either a lawyer's careful phrasing or an accountant's stubborn refusal to admit a mistake. He suspected the latter. He'd brought copies. 12 of them, stapled, 1 for each board member, 1 for Briarstone's on-site manager, 1 for the record, and, because he'd learned enough by now to know how these things worked, 1 for Denise Okafor, who was sitting in the front row with a notebook, presumably preparing her next Facebook update. "Before the board issues any fines," Ethan said, standing, "I'd like to enter into the record a certified copy of the 1994 conveyance deed from Weatherstone Development Group to the then owner of Lot 17, transferring fee simple title to all undedicated common areas of Falcon Ridge Estates, including the roadway known as Falcon Ridge Court, and a current title report confirming that interest passed, through successive sales, to me and my wife upon our purchase of 44-7 Falcon Ridge Court in 2024. The room went very quiet. Don Kowalski, the treasurer, actually reached for the document before Marla could stop him. "That's not," Marla started, then stopped, flipping through the pages Ethan had handed her. "This is where did you even get this?" "The Cobb County Recorder's Office," Ethan said, "where anyone could have gotten it, at any point in the last 32 years, if anyone had checked before building a stone wall on my land while I was on my honeymoon. $2,500 in threatened fines over a wall the board built on his own land, against Ethan Marsh, a man who'd been home from his honeymoon for less than a month. Is this legal where you live?" What would you have done in his position? The May 20th hearing did not end with an apology. It ended with Marla Fenwick declaring, red-faced, that the document was clearly outdated and irrelevant to the board's authority under the current governing documents, and adjourning the meeting before a vote could be taken on anything at all. Don Kowalski did not look at Ethan on the way out. Priscilla Yates's official minutes of the meeting, distributed 6 days later, made no mention of the deed whatsoever, describing the hearing only as an update on the beautification project timeline and general Q&A. What followed, over the next 6 weeks, was the part of the story Ethan would later describe, in a deposition he never wanted to give, as the part where I found out how far a group of unpaid volunteers with a shared Google Drive will go before they'll admit they're wrong. The first move was financial. On June 2nd, Briarstone Community Management sent every household in Falcon Ridge Estates a notice of a special assessment, $18,750 per lot, due within 60 days, to cover unanticipated legal and administrative costs associated with a title dispute initiated by a homeowner regarding the community entrance beautification project. 42 lots, just under $787,500, extracted from families who had, almost to a person, no idea their board had built a wall on somebody else's land in the first place, in order to pay lawyers to fight the person whose land it was. Denise Okafor, to her credit, was the first neighbor to actually knock on Ethan and Claire's door. "Is it true?" she asked, standing on their porch with her arms crossed, in a posture that suggested she'd rehearsed being angry at Ethan and hadn't yet recalibrated. "Marla's saying you're trying to sue the whole neighborhood over a wall." "I haven't sued anyone," Ethan said. "I own the road, Denise. I own Falcon Ridge Court. Legally, on paper, since 1994, and nobody, not the board, not Briarstone, not the title company that closed on your house, or mine, ever checked." "That's insane," Denise said. "It is," Ethan agreed. "I'd love it if it weren't true, but it's in the county's own records. I can show you." He did show her. 15 minutes later, Denise Okafor left his kitchen table considerably paler than she'd arrived, holding photocopies of a 1994 quitclaim deed, and did not post anything on Facebook for the first time in recorded memory. She came back 4 days later, unannounced, this time with her own Recorder of Deeds printout for Lot 15, the house she and her husband had owned since 2011. "I've been the loudest person in this neighborhood, defending that board for 6 years, she told Ethan, standing on his porch a second time, considerably less certain than she'd been the first. "I organized the petition to get Marla re-elected in 2023. I need you to tell me honestly, is this actually as bad as it looks, or am I about to make a fool of myself for nothing?" Ethan walked her through the deed, the plat, and Exhibit A's absent legal description, the same way he'd have explained a parcel dispute to a colleague at the assessor's office, without embellishment, because the facts, by that point, no longer needed any help from him to sound damning. "Then I owe some people an apology," Denise said, and left with a second set of copies, for her husband this time. She would spend the better part of the next week making that apology in person, one porch at a time, to neighbors she'd spent the better part of 6 years talking into siding with the board on almost everything, a project she later described, with some embarrassment, as the least fun door-knocking campaign of my life. The second move, and the one that turned the dispute from an argument into a siege, came on June 19th, when Briarstone's on-site property manager, a tired man named Gary Ott, who had clearly wanted no part of this from the beginning, delivered a letter informing the Marshes that the board had voted 4-1, Kowalski dissenting, to place a lien on 4417 Falcon Ridge Court for $3,340 in accumulated fines. The original $150 landscaping violation, now compounded weekly per the CC&R's escalation schedule, plus a new $2,500 fine for willful interference with association operations and public disparagement of board members, stemming from Ethan's continued insistence, in emails and at the hearing, that he owned the land the wall sat on. A lien on a house Ethan and Claire had owned for 2 years, that they'd refinanced 6 months earlier, at a rate they'd fought hard for, filed against the county land records for the crime of telling the truth about who owned the driveway. The lien surfaced somewhere Ethan and Claire hadn't anticipated, 3 weeks later, when Claire's credit union flagged it during a routine review tied to an auto loan she'd applied for on a new car to replace the 10-year-old sedan that had finally given out. The loan officer, apologetic but firm, explained that a recorded lien against the marital residence, regardless of its underlying merit, was enough to complicate the underwriting, and that they'd need documentation showing it was disputed and likely to be released before the loan could move forward at the rate they'd been quoted. Claire ended up financing at a 1.5 higher than she would have otherwise, a detail she brought up more than once in the months that followed, not as an accusation, exactly, but as a running tally of exactly what this fight was costing them in numbers that had nothing to do with a stone wall. At the hospital, the dispute followed her in smaller ways. A coworker on her unit, whose sister-in-law happened to live 2 subdivisions over, mentioned having seen something about a wall on the local news before anyone outside Falcon Ridge Estates had any idea the Marshes were involved, and Claire spent an uncomfortable 10 minutes in the break room confirming, yes, that was her husband. Yes, that was their actual house. No, they had not in fact done anything wrong. She got used to the question over the following months. She never got used to answering it during a lunch break that was supposed to be 20 minutes of not thinking about anything at all. What she did get used to, eventually, was the small, private satisfaction of watching a stranger's face change from polite curiosity to open disbelief once she got to the part about the wall, the honeymoon, and the plaque, a reaction she came to think of as the story doing its own work, long before anyone at the hospital had heard the phrase quitclaim deed for the first time. Ethan's own workplace took the news rather differently. The Cobb County Assessor's Office, an agency not generally known for celebrity within its own building, found itself with a minor local legend on staff, and Ethan's supervisor, a woman named Deb Alvarez who had spent 11 years training analysts to read exactly the kind of chain of title gap Ethan had found, printed the news segment's transcript and posted it on the break room corkboard under a handwritten note that read, simply, "This is why we double-check the recorder's office." It stayed up for the better part of a year, until someone finally took it down to make room for a flyer about the office holiday potluck, at which point Deb Alvarez simply photographed it, framed the photo instead, and set it on her desk, where it remains today. Claire, who had until this point handled the entire ordeal with the calm professional detachment of an ICU nurse, who has seen worse, cried in the kitchen that night, not from fear exactly, but from the specific, grinding exhaustion of watching people who had never met her decide, on paper, that her home was collateral in an argument she hadn't started. "They can't actually take the house over this," she said. "Can they?" "Not easily," Ethan said, which was true, and also not nearly reassuring enough, because liens have a way of following a property through refinances and sales and credit checks long after the underlying dispute has been forgotten by everyone except the person trying to close on their next mortgage. The neighbors, once Denise's silence and then her quiet, appalled retelling of the deed, had made its way around the cul-de-sac, split roughly into 3 camps, a handful, mostly the ones on the board's Christmas card list, people who'd lived in Falcon Ridge Estates since the Weatherstone days and trusted Marla the way you trust a bank teller you've known for 20 years, insisted this had to be some kind of clerical mistake that the lawyers would sort out. A larger, quieter group started doing what Ethan had done, pulling their own deeds, checking their own parcel numbers, discovering with mounting alarm that every single one of their driveways ran, at some point, across the strip of land now legally owned by the Marshes. And a third group, small at first but growing, decided that a board willing to fine a man for pointing out a title defect the board itself had created was a board that needed to not be a board anymore. The social cost landed on Claire more than Ethan, in the way these things often do, since she was the one who actually ran into people at the mailbox cluster and the community pool. A woman 2 doors down, whom Claire had considered a friend since they'd bonded over matching porch pumpkins the first October the Marshes lived there, stopped waving. Another neighbor, at a 4th of July gathering, Claire attended alone because Ethan was working a Saturday shift covering a colleague's parcel appeals backlog, made a comment just loud enough to carry, "Must be nice, owning the whole neighborhood now," that left Claire standing by the drinks table for a full minute, deciding whether it was worth a response. She decided it wasn't, went home, and told Ethan about it later, with the particular weariness of someone who had spent all day holding other people's crises at the hospital and did not especially want to come home to one of her own. Before hiring Renata formally, Ethan spent 2 more evenings doing the kind of work nobody had asked him to do, but that his training made almost impossible to resist. He pulled the deeds for every lot along the affected stretch of Falcon Ridge Court, lots 14 through 19, and confirmed what he already suspected. Every single one described its access rights the same way, as an appurtenant easement over the roadway serving the subdivision, with no lots deed anywhere claiming fee ownership of the road itself, because no title company doing those closings had ever traced the chain back to the 1994 dissolution filings. He built a simple map, the kind he made professionally a dozen times a week, overlaying the recorded boundary of Lot 17 against the physical footprint of Falcon Ridge Court, the wall, and the triangular overflow parking pad behind Lots 18 and 19. It showed, in a single clean image, exactly how much of what everyone in the subdivision believed belonged to the association actually ran through a private title held by one household. He would use that map, eventually, more than any other single document in the entire dispute. Ethan hired Renata Cho formally on July 1st. Her first act was to send Briarstone a certified letter demanding the lien be released within 10 days or face a slander of title action, alongside a formal notice, the one that would, 3 weeks later, turn Falcon Ridge Estates upside down, revoking, effective immediately, the implied license for the Homeowners Association and any third-party contractor to enter, maintain, plow, repave, or otherwise use the roadway known as Falcon Ridge Court without the express written permission of its titled owners, Ethan and Claire Marsh. Ethan just made a critical move, revoking the HOA's right to use its own road, on paper, in writing, with a lawyer copied. Was that the right call? What's your strategy? Tell me in the comments. The board did not release the lien. What they did instead, on the advice of an attorney they'd retained on an emergency basis, a man named Wallace Trent, who billed the association $410 an hour and would, over the following 4 months, personally cost Falcon Ridge Estates more in legal fees than the wall itself had cost to build, was to argue, in a strongly worded response letter, that regardless of who held paper title to the roadway, the association had acquired a prescriptive easement through decades of open, notorious, and continuous use, and that the Marsh's revocation notice was, in Wallace Trent's words, legally inert. Ethan, reading this over Renata's shoulder in her office, actually laughed. A prescriptive easement requires the use to be adverse, Renata explained to him later, over coffee, once she'd stopped being annoyed on his behalf. Hostile to the true owner's rights. But every single deed in this subdivision, going back to 1987, described this road as a shared community amenity maintained by the association for the benefit of the lots. That's not hostile use. That's permissive use, under a mistaken but mutual belief about who owned it. A prescriptive easement claim actually requires them to prove they knew they didn't have permission and used it anyway. Marla Fenwick's own emails, where she calls it the community's road, are going to sink that argument for her. It was around this time, late July, roughly 3 months after the Marshes had come home to a wall in their backyard, that the practical, physical reality of who owned Falcon Ridge Court started to become impossible to ignore, because Ethan, on Renata's advice, stopped merely asserting his ownership on paper and started demonstrating it in the one language a homeowners association has never once failed to understand: inconvenience. He didn't block the road entirely. Renata was very clear that doing so recklessly, in a way that could be construed as endangering emergency access, would expose him to liability regardless of who held title. But he did, on a Saturday morning in late July, hire a licensed surveyor to formally restake the boundary of his parcel, driving iron pins at the true corners of Lot 17, corners that happened to sit not at the edge of his backyard, as everyone had assumed for 32 years, but well out into the middle of the private road itself, since he owned the whole thing. He then had a fence contractor install a single, code-compliant, 5-foot decorative post and rail fence directly along that surveyed boundary at the entrance to the cul-de-sac, on his own land, well within his legal right, running for exactly the 11 feet needed to demonstrate, unmistakably, that the entrance to Falcon Ridge Court passed entirely through property he owned. He left a single 12-foot gate in the fence, wide enough for a car, secured with a keyed padlock, and mailed every household on the affected stretch of road a formal notarized letter granting them a temporary, revocable, 30-day personal license to use the gate, as a courtesy, without prejudice to the Marsh's ownership rights, and subject to renewal at the sole discretion of the title holders. 18 households, every one of them now needed Ethan Marsh's explicit, revocable permission to get their own cars out of their own driveways. Renata had insisted, before any of it went up, on a level of procedural care that made the whole maneuver considerably less satisfying in the moment than it would later look on the news. The fence was surveyed and staked by a licensed professional, permitted through the county exactly as any homeowner's fence project would be, and built entirely within the property line. No part of it obstructed the travel lane itself, only marked, unambiguously, where that lane crossed onto land the Marshes owned. The 30-day courtesy licenses were delivered by certified mail to every affected household, not just posted at the gate, specifically so no one could later claim they hadn't been given fair notice or a clear path to keep using the road they'd used for years. It was, Renata told him more than once, annoying to build a leverage point this carefully, but it meant that when Wallace Trent inevitably went looking for a way to paint Ethan as reckless or retaliatory, there would be nothing to find. Within days, a coalition began forming that had nothing to do with the gate directly, and everything to do with what the gate had forced people to finally look at. A retired contractor named Hal Weinberg, who'd lived at 4425 Falcon Ridge Court since 1996 and had never once questioned a board decision in 3 decades, pulled his own deed for the first time since closing and spent an entire Saturday afternoon at Ethan's kitchen table, cross-referencing it against the county GIS portal. 2 younger couples who'd bought into the subdivision in the last 5 years and who had quietly resented the board's fee structure for reasons that had nothing to do with the wall, started a group chat that within a week had 11 members trading screenshots of their own violation notices, their own oddly escalating fines, their own unanswered emails to Briarstone, and, in one case, a photo of a $75 fine issued for a garbage can left at the curb 4 hours past the guideline window, time-stamped the same week the board approved nearly $800,000 in emergency legal spending without a vote. What had started as one household's property dispute was, by the second week of August, something closer to an audit of the entire board's 6-year track record, conducted entirely by homeowners who had never previously spoken to one another. The fallout was immediate and, by any objective measure, spectacular. Within 4 hours of the fence going up, Marla Fenwick was standing at the gate, in full view of at least 6 neighbors who had come outside specifically to watch, demanding that Ethan open it before someone calls the police. "I'd be happy to talk to the police," Ethan said, standing on his own side of his own fence. "I own this road. I have a certified deed, a title report, and a licensed survey confirming exactly where my property line runs. I've granted every household a 30-day courtesy license, which I'm under no legal obligation to do, and which I'll gladly renew the moment the board releases the lien on my house, drops the $2,500 fine for public disparagement, and agrees, in writing, to remove the wall from my property or compensate me for the portion of my land they've permanently taken." "You can't hold 18 families hostage over a fence dispute," Marla said. "I'm not holding anyone hostage," Ethan said. "I'm exercising the same authority over common area access that this board has claimed for 6 years, over a road it turns out it never owned in the first place. If that feels unfair, Marla, I'd encourage you to imagine how it felt to come home from my honeymoon to a wall in my backyard and a bill for landscaping I never violated." Hal Weinberg, standing among the small crowd that had gathered, called out from the sidewalk before Marla could answer. "He's not wrong about the deed, Marla. I checked mine this morning. It doesn't say what you think it says either." A murmur went through the small group, the specific sound of a dozen people simultaneously recalculating who they trusted. Marla did not respond to Hal directly. She turned back to Ethan, said, "This isn't over," in the tone of someone who still believed she held the stronger hand, and walked back down the court toward her own house, past a gate she now needed permission to drive through herself. By that evening, the video of the exchange, filmed inevitably by Denise Okafor, who had switched sides with the speed and total conviction of a woman who'd once posted 3 exclamation points about the wall and now felt personally betrayed by it, had been viewed 11,000 times on the Neighbourhood Facebook group alone, and had made its way, by morning, to a local news tip line. After everything Ethan Marsh went through, the wall, the fines, the lien on his house, the gate, was it worth it? Have you ever fought your HOA? Won, lost, or walked away? Tell me your story. WCPO's consumer affairs reporter, a woman named Aditi Bhatt, who had built a minor local following covering exactly this kind of dispute, called Ethan directly on July 29th, having gotten his number from Denise Okafor, who by this point had appointed herself Ethan's unofficial press liaison out of what Ethan suspected was equal parts guilt and enthusiasm for the drama. "I have a certified deed, a licensed survey, and a title report," Ethan told her, on camera, standing at his own gate, with the wall visible over his shoulder in the background. "The Falcon Ridge Estates Homeowners Association built a permanent stone structure on my property, while my wife and I were on our honeymoon. When I pointed out, politely, that this violated my property rights, they fined me, then placed a lien on my home, then billed 42 families, nearly $800,000, to fight me over land the association never legally owned. I didn't ask for any of this. I just want my land back, or fair compensation for it, and I want my neighbors to stop being billed for the board's mistake." Marla Fenwick, when Aditi Bhatt reached her for comment, declined an on-camera interview but provided a written statement insisting that the association's legal position remains strong and that Mr. Marsh's actions, including the erection of a gate restricting community access, represent an escalation that the board deeply regrets having been forced into. The story aired on the 6 o'clock news on August 2nd under the headline, "Millbrook Falls Man Locks Out Entire Neighborhood Over HOA Dispute, but Records Suggest He May Be Right." It included an interview with Renata Cho, who explained, in the calm, precise tone of a lawyer who knows the camera is helping her client, the concept of a scrivener's error in a 1994 conveyance, and what it meant for 32 years of assumed common area ownership. It included a shot of the plaque on the wall, Beautified 2026, Board of Directors, lingering just long enough for the irony to land. And it included, devastatingly for Marla Fenwick, 45 seconds of board meeting audio, subpoenaed by Renata during discovery and leaked, almost certainly by Don Kowalski, in which Marla could be heard saying, 8 months earlier, "I don't care whose name is on the deed technically. It's the community's road, and it's staying that way." Not hostile use, not adverse. An acknowledgement, on tape, that the board knew the deed said something other than what they wanted, and had decided to build the wall anyway. The story didn't stop at the local news broadcast. A regional real estate law blog picked it up 2 days later under the headline, "The HOA that fenced out its own homeowners." And from there, it made its way to a real estate-focused podcast with a national listenership, which spent 40 minutes of an episode dissecting the 1994 quitclaim deed and interviewing a property law professor from a state university about how common such scrivener's gaps actually are in older subdivisions. More common, the professor said, than anyone in the title insurance industry likes to admit, particularly in developments where the original developer dissolved before ever formally dedicating common areas to a homeowners association. Ethan started getting messages from strangers in other states, describing their own private roads, their own unresolved questions about who actually owned the strip of grass their mailbox sat on. He answered as many as he reasonably could, mostly by telling people to do exactly what he'd done: go pull the deed. Within a week of the broadcast, the Ohio Attorney General's Consumer Protection Section had opened an inquiry into Falcon Ridge Estates' financial practices, prompted by 11 separate homeowner complaints about the special assessment, several of which specifically alleged that the board had authorized a nearly $800,000 legal fund without a proper homeowner vote, a potential violation of the association's own bylaws requiring membership approval for any assessment exceeding 15% of the annual budget. Don Kowalski resigned from the board on August 11th, releasing a short statement that read, in its entirety, "I no longer believe the current leadership is acting in the association's best financial interest, and I cannot, in good conscience, continue to sign documents I have concerns about." 2 other households that had been quietly organizing since Denise Okafor's conversion filed a formal petition under Article 16 of the CC&Rs, demanding a special membership meeting to consider recall of the entire board. 211 signatures out of a possible 84 eligible voting households, some lots had 2 owners on title, were gathered in 9 days. It remains, according to Briarstone Community Management's own records, the fastest recall petition threshold ever reached in that firm's 22-year history of managing Ohio associations. Before the recall petition ever reached a vote, Wallace Trent made one last attempt to change the terms of the fight entirely. In late August, he sent Renata Cho a letter proposing that the association initiate condemnation proceedings against the disputed strip of Ethan's land, arguing that the roadway served a legitimate public-facing function: emergency vehicle access, mail delivery, utility maintenance, that could justify a forced taking under Ohio's eminent domain framework, provided the association compensated the marshes at fair market value. It was, on its face, a serious legal threat, the kind that could have dragged the case into years of appraisal disputes and court filings far more expensive than anything that had come before. It was also, as Renata quickly pointed out in her response, legally hollow. Homeowners associations are private corporations, not government entities, and have no eminent domain authority under Ohio law, regardless of how a private road functions. Wallace Trent withdrew the theory within a week. In a one-line email that Renata printed out and kept, she told Ethan, for the next time somebody tries something like this. The special membership meeting was held on September 9th, not in the cramped Millbrook Falls Public Library meeting room, but in the gymnasium of Falcon Ridge Elementary, because Briarstone, for once demonstrating a flicker of institutional self-preservation, had insisted on a venue that could legally accommodate the anticipated quorum. It was, by every account later given, one of the most attended HOA meetings in Cobb County history. 61 of 84 eligible households showed up in person. Another 14 submitted proxies. Marla Fenwick sat at a folding table at the front of the gym, flanked by Priscilla Yates and the 2 remaining board members. Wallace Trent, the attorney, seated conspicuously behind them, and delivered a 20-minute opening statement defending the beautification project, the special assessment, and the lien, in that order, none of which anyone in the room appeared to be buying. Hal Weinberg spoke before Ethan did, standing without being called on, his voice carrying easily across the gymnasium without a microphone. "I've lived here 30 years, he said. I trusted every board this community ever had, including this one, because I figured somebody was checking the paperwork so the rest of us didn't have to. Turns out nobody was checking anything. I don't want to talk about the wall anymore. I want to talk about the fact that I've paid this board $14,000 in dues since Marla took over, and I have no idea, until 3 weeks ago, what any of it actually bought." A woman Ethan didn't recognize from one of the newer households in the group chat read a list of 6 other homeowners' violation notices issued in the past year, comparing fine amounts side by side, and asked, pointedly, why 2 households on the board's own street had never been cited for anything at all in 6 years. Priscilla Yates, at the folding table, stared at her own binder rather than answer. Ethan spoke for 4 minutes. He did not raise his voice once. "I want to be very clear about what I'm asking for," he said, standing at a microphone someone had wheeled out for the occasion, Claire beside him, Renata Cho a few rows back with a folder of documents she never had to open, because by this point, the county deed, the survey, and the audio recording had already been passed around the gymnasium more times than anyone could count. "I never wanted a gate. I put up a fence and a lock because it was the only way, after 4 months, to get this board to take a deed seriously. I'm asking the association to release the lien on my home. I'm asking for the wall to either be removed from my property or for fair compensation for the land it permanently occupies, at market rate, determined by an independent appraiser. And I'm asking every household in this room to think very hard about whether you want to keep paying dues to a board that spent nearly $800,000 of your dollars fighting a homeowner instead of spending $80 4 months ago on the survey that would have told them exactly what I just told you for free." The recall vote was taken by paper ballot, tabulated on the spot by a court reporter Renata had arranged, purely to head off any dispute about the accuracy of Priscilla Yates's minutes. Marla Fenwick was removed from the board 58-3, with 14 abstaining proxies. Priscilla Yates was removed 54-7. The 2 remaining board members resigned voluntarily, on the spot, rather than face a vote neither of them expected to survive. A new interim board. 3 members, including, at the community's insistent request, Ethan Marsh himself, who accepted on the condition that he'd serve only through the resolution of his own claim and then step down to avoid any conflict of interest, was elected by acclamation before the meeting adjourned. Hal Weinberg took the second seat. A pediatric nurse named Rosa Delgadillo, no relation to Claire despite the shared surname and the jokes it produced for months afterward, took the third, having spent the prior 6 weeks quietly organizing the newer households group chat into something closer to an actual voting block. Marla Fenwick left the gymnasium before the final tally was formally announced, walking out through a side door usually reserved for the school's custodial staff, past a small cluster of reporters who had shown up on the strength of the earlier broadcast and were now considerably more interested in the story than the local paper had originally budgeted for. She did not respond to requests for comment that evening, or in the weeks that followed. Wallace Trent submitted a final invoice to the outgoing board's operating account 2 days later for $6,150, which the incoming board declined to pay pending its own review of the association's finances, a review that would, within a month, uncover the line items nobody had thought to question while Marla Fenwick was still signing the checks. Was it worth it? Marla Fenwick sitting silent at that folding table while 58 hands went up against her. Every viewer watching this has their own answer, and I want to hear yours in the comments below. The Ohio Attorney General's inquiry concluded in November, resulting in a consent agreement rather than formal charges. The Falcon Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, under its new interim board, agreed to refund the unauthorized portion of the $18,750 special assessment to all 42 households, roughly $600 of the original $787,500, the difference representing legitimate legal costs the new board agreed had actually been incurred, and to submit all future assessments exceeding 15% of the annual operating budget to a mandatory membership vote, in strict compliance with the association's own bylaws going forward. Ethan and Claire's lien was released on October 3rd, 6 weeks before the recall vote even happened, once Wallace Trent, no longer being paid by a board that no longer existed in its old form, quietly advised the interim board that continuing to defend it would be, in his written words, not a winnable position given the deed, the survey, and the recorded audio. The negotiation over the special assessment refund was, in its own way, more contentious than the recall vote itself, because it required the new interim board to sit across a table from the very legal fees they were now trying to claw back on the community's behalf. Renata Cho and Wallace Trent, sitting on opposite sides of a conference table for what both later admitted was a strange and slightly exhausting professional experience, spent 3 sessions over 2 weeks combing through Briarstone's itemized billing, item by item, with Hal Weinberg, newly installed and clearly relishing the audit, asking pointed questions about a $12,000 line item for strategic communications consulting that turned out to be a single afternoon a public relations contractor had spent drafting talking points for Marla Fenwick's declined television interview. That line item was struck entirely. So was a $6,400 charge for emergency board retreat, billed the same week the lien was filed, which Wallace Trent, to his limited credit, did not even attempt to defend once Hal read the description out loud to the room. The wall itself became the subject of the last real negotiation. Renata Cho and the new board's replacement counsel settled on a figure of $94,000, paid to the Marshes by the association's insurance carrier under an errors and omissions policy that covered board decisions made in good faith but poor judgment. Good faith being a generous characterization, Ethan thought privately. But he took the settlement anyway, because $94,000 was $94,000, and because the alternative, forcing the actual physical removal of a wall his neighbors had, by then, genuinely started to like the look of, seemed like a pointless kind of vengeance that would have cost everyone, including him, another 18 months in court. The gate came down on the first weekend of October, replaced by the decorative fence alone, still standing exactly on the true property line, no longer locked, a permanent and entirely legal marker of exactly where 32 years of assumption had been, quietly, catastrophically wrong. The transition itself was not entirely smooth. 2 of the households who had stayed loyal to Marla Fenwick through the recall vote initially refused to recognize the interim board's authority to negotiate the refund at all, filing a formal objection with Briarstone, arguing that any settlement reached without a full second membership vote would be invalid. Renata addressed it in a single afternoon, citing the bylaw's own provision, granting the sitting board full authority to settle litigation and disputed claims on the association's behalf, the same authority Marla Fenwick's board had exercised, without objection from anyone, when it authorized the original $787,500 assessment. The objection was withdrawn within the week, though not, Ethan noted, before one of the two households sent a lengthy email to the entire distribution list accusing the interim board of moving too fast, an irony nobody but Claire seemed to fully appreciate. Ethan served on the interim board for 4 months, long enough to help draft a new set of bylaws requiring an independent title search before any association-funded construction project over $5,000, a policy that Cobb County's own HOA oversight office later cited, in an unrelated newsletter, as a model other associations should consider adopting. He resigned in February, as promised, once the by-then permanent board, led by, of all people, Denise Okafor, elected in a landslide on a platform Ethan found both funny and entirely appropriate, titled simply, "Check the Deed First," was fully seated and functioning. Hal Weinberg took the treasurer's seat on the permanent board and instituted a rule, adopted unanimously, requiring an independent annual audit of all violation notices issued, cross-checked by street, specifically to catch the kind of selective enforcement pattern the newer homeowners had flagged at the recall meeting. 2 of the households cited in that comparison later received formal apologies and refunds for fines the audit found had no basis in the actual landscaping guidelines. Gary Ott kept his job as the on-site property manager, on the theory, which the new board adopted explicitly, that he had never been the problem so much as a man following bad instructions from people who no longer worked there. Marla Fenwick sold her house on Falcon Ridge Court the following spring and moved to a condominium development across the county, one that, according to Denise Okafor, who kept in occasional touch through a mutual acquaintance and could not resist checking, had no homeowners association at all. Priscilla Yates stayed in the neighborhood, kept mostly to herself, and eventually, 2 annual meetings later, showed up to volunteer for the landscaping committee under the new board's considerably less punitive set of guidelines, an offer Rosa Delgadillo accepted without comment, on the theory that a fresh start was worth more to the community than a long memory. Falcon Ridge Estates today runs its annual dues at $310, down from $340, the difference reflecting a management contract renegotiated after the association, for the first time in its history, actually put its property management firm's performance out to competitive bid. The entrance wall still stands, plaque and all, though someone, the new board has never confirmed who, and Ethan has never asked, quietly had the bronze plaque re-engraved. It no longer credits the board of directors. It simply reads, "The Estates at Falcon Ridge, Este, 1987. Ethan and Claire still live at 4417 Falcon Ridge Court." Claire says, when people ask, that she got a stone wall and a lawsuit as a wedding gift, and that at this point, she considers both part of the marriage. Ethan keeps the framed 1994 quitclaim deed in his home office, not out of pride exactly, but as a reminder of something he now tells anyone who'll listen, at cul-de-sac barbecues and county assessor conferences alike. Nobody, in 32 years, ever checked who actually owned the road under their own driveway. All it took to find out was one honeymoon, one wall, and one man who happened to know exactly where to look. On their second wedding anniversary, Ethan and Claire hosted a small dinner in the backyard, close enough to the wall that the lanterns Marla Fenwick had installed on timers still clicked on automatically at dusk, casting soft light across a fence line that no longer meant anything adversarial to anyone standing near it. Hal Weinberg came. So did Denise Okafor and her husband. Nobody mentioned the gate. It had, by then, become the kind of neighborhood story people told new residents over the fence rather than a wound anyone was still nursing. The time the whole cul-de-sac found out, all at once, that the ground under their driveways belonged to somebody else, and the somebody else turned out to be reasonable about it. Eventually, once everyone stopped assuming and started reading. Renata Cho still keeps a framed copy of the Falcon Ridge Court survey map in her office. the one Ethan built the first weekend he understood what he was actually looking at, and shows it to new clients who come in convinced their own HOA dispute is too small, too petty, or too embarrassing to be worth a lawyer's time. It rarely takes more than one look at that map and the story behind it to convince them otherwise. If your own HOA has ever built something you didn't approve, fined you for something you didn't do, or made you feel like your own deed didn't matter, you already know it's worth checking. Subscribe to HOA Horror Files for the next story of a homeowner who checked the fine print and won.